Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 32 of Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam. It's the 32nd day on the second canto, and we're right at the end. We're in chapter 10, last chapter of the second canto, titled Bhagavatam is the answer to all questions. Yes, and we're continuing on from chapter 9, and let us begin with our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachadesha Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Right, so verse 9. All three of the above-mentioned stages of different living entities are interdependent. In the absence of one, another is not understood. But the Supreme Being, who sees every one of them as the shelter of the shelter, is independent of all, and therefore he is the supreme shelter. Okay, so let's get into the purport. Prabhupada begins, there are innumerable living entities, one dependent on the other, in the relationship of the controlled and the controller. And of course we're talking about adhyatmic, adhidaivik, and adhibautic purushas. Right, so anyway, that was Prabhupada began the purport, but then he goes on that without the medium of perception, no one can know who is controlled and who's the controller. For example, the sun controls our power of vision, but the sunlight's only useful because we have eyes. This is interdependence. Without our eyes, what's the point of sunlight? We're just in darkness anyway. Yeah, so they're interdependent. So whoever made this interdependence must ultimately be independent. So who's that? And it is the Super Soul Paramatma, who is not dependent on anything or anyone else. And therefore he's called Swa-ashraya, only dependent on himself. If you analyze that word, swashraya, it means that he is the shelter of the shelters, and he is his own shelter, swa. Yeah. So he's the supreme shelter of everything. And Bhagavan, of course, Bhagavan is the ultimate shelter because he's the source of the super soul. So he's the shelter of the super soul and Brahman. Anyway, Prabhupada goes on, there's no qualitative difference between the soul and super soul, but still the soul is dependent on the super soul for liberation and just for everything when you get down to it. The soul is under the clutches of Maya, and therefore, although qualitatively one with the super soul, the soul is under the illusion of identifying with matter. So to get out of this, he has to depend on the Supersoul. So therefore the Supersoul is the supreme shelter. And we go into the second paragraph, that we, the jivas, we're always dependent on the Supersoul. Because we forget our spiritual position, our spiritual identity, whereas he never forgets. In Bhagavad Gita, in the 4th chapter, this Prabhupada points out this difference is mentioned where Arjuna is Prabhupada said, Arjuna is represented as forgetful of previous births, but the Supersoul is not forgetful. He remembers everything, as Bhagavad Gita chapter 7 verse 26 states. It's quoted there in full. Lord Krishna he knows he says, Krishna says, I know everything that's happened in the past, everything which is happening at present, and all things that are yet to come. I also know all living entities, but me no one knows. That's a real classic verse. So he's omniscient and the shelter of Paramatma and Brahman. Then the last little paragraph, Prabhupada talks about, it's sort of the New Age idea, propaganda of the oneness, the identity of cosmic consciousness with the consciousness of the individual living entities. That's us. Prabhupada says this propaganda is completely misleading. Because even someone as advanced as Arjuna couldn't remember his previous activities, even though he's always with the Lord. Many, many births both you and I have passed together, Krishna says to Arjuna. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, and what can the tiny ordinary man, falsely claiming to be one with the cosmic consciousness, know about his past, present, and future? Well, we can ask ourselves, can't we? Because that's our position. We're little living beings. So, and we don't know. We remember our past, obviously, to some degree, but not that much at all. Like last night, I gave class for a couple of hours, but I can't remember much of what I said. Yes, even though I was the one who said it, and it was just a few hours ago. Like, say 12 hours ago or thereabouts. So now we go on to the next section, which is from verse 10 to verse 47, means it's really a big section. It's really very big. And this is called the creation by Garbhodakshai Vishnu. So let's read through the verses. It's going to take a while. Verse 10, after separating the different universes, the gigantic universal form of the Lord, Mahavishnu, which came out of the causal ocean, the place of appearance for the first Purusha avatar. So, yes, he entered into each of the separate universes, desiring to lie on the created transcendental water, which is known as Garbhodak. Yes, so Mahavishnu then went into each universe to lie down on the waters there. Then he's Garbhodakshai Vishnu. Verse 11. The Supreme Person is not impersonal, and therefore is distinctly a Nara or person. Therefore the transcendental water created from the Supreme Nara is known as Nara. And because he lies down on that water, he's known as Narayana. Verse 12. One should definitely know that all material ingredients, activities, time and modes, and the living entities who are meant to enjoy them all, exist by his mercy only. And as soon as he does not care for them, everything becomes non-existent. 13. The Lord, while lying on his bed of mystic slumber, generated the seminal symbol, golden in hue, through external energy, out of his desire to manifest varieties of living entities from himself alone. 14. Just hear from me how the potency of his lordship divides one into three, called the controlling entities, the controlled entities, and the material bodies, in the manner mentioned above. 15. From the sky situated within the transcendental body of the manifesting Mahavishnu, sense energy, mental force, and bodily strength are all generated, as well as the sum total of the fountainhead of the total living force. 16. As the followers of a king follow their lord, similarly, when the total energy is in motion, all other living entities move. And when the total energy stops endeavoring, all other living entities stop sensual activities. 17. The living force, being agitated by the Virat Purusha, generated hunger and thirst. And when he desired to drink and eat, the mouth opened. 18. From the mouth the palate became manifested, and thereupon the tongue was also generated. After this all the different tastes came into existence, so that the tongue can relish them. 19. When the Supreme desired to speak, speeches were vibrated from the mouth. Then the controlling deity fire was generated from the mouth. But when he was lying in the water, all these functions remained suspended. 20. Thereafter, when the Supreme Purusha desired to smell odors, the nostrils and respiration were generated, the nasal instrument and odors came into existence, and the controlling deity of air carrying smell also became manifested. 21. Thus, when everything existed in darkness, the Lord desired to see himself and all that was created. Then the eyes, the illuminating God's Son, the power of vision and the object of sight, all became manifested. 22. By development of the desire of the great sages to know, the ears, the power of hearing, the controlling deity of hearing, and the objects of hearing became manifested. The great sages desired to hear about the self. 23. When there was a desire to perceive the physical characteristics of matter, such as softness, hardness, warmth, cold, lightness and heaviness, the background of sensation, the skin pores, the hairs on the body, and their controlling deities, the trees, were generated. Within and outside the skin is a covering of air, through which sense perception became prominent. Thereafter, when the Supreme Person desired to perform varieties of work, the two hands and their controlling strength, and Indra, the demigod in heaven, became manifested, as also the acts dependent on both the hands and the demigod. 25. Thereupon, because of his desiring to control movement, his legs became manifested, and from the legs the controlling deity named Vishnu was generated. By his personal supervision of this act, all varieties of human being are busily engaged in dutiful occupational sacrifice. 26. Thereupon, for sexual pleasure, begetting offspring, and tasting heavenly nectar, the Lord developed the genitals, and thus there is the genital organ and its controlling deity, the Prajapati. The object of sexual pleasure and the controlling deity are under the control of the genitals of the Lord. 27. Thereafter, when he desired to evacuate the refuse of eatables, the evacuating hole, anus, and the sensory organ thereof developed along with the controlling deity Mitra. The sensory organ and the evacuating substance are both under the shelter of the controlling deity. 28. Thereafter, when he desired to move from one body to another, the navel and the air of departure and death were combinedly created. The navel is the shelter for both, namely death and the separating force. 29. When there was a desire to have food and drink, the abdomen and the intestines and also the arteries became manifested. The rivers and seas are the source of their sustenance and metabolism. 30. When there was a desire to think about the activities of his own energy, then the heart, the seat of the mind, the moon, determination, and all desire became manifested. 31. The 7 elements of the body, namely the thin layer on the skin itself, the flesh, blood, fat, marrow, and bone, are all made of earth, water, and fire, whereas the life breath is produced by the sky, water, and air. 32. The sense organs are attached to the modes of material nature, and the modes of material nature are products of the false ego. The mind is subjected to all kinds of material experiences of happiness and distress, and the intelligence is the feature of the mind's deliberation. Interesting. 33. Thus, by all this, the external feature of the personality of Godhead is covered by gross forms, such as those of planets, which were explained to you by me. 34. Therefore, beyond this gross manifestation is a transcendental manifestation, finer than the finest form. It has no beginning, no intermediate stage, and no end. Therefore, it is beyond the limits of expression or mental speculation, and is distinct from the material conception. 35. Neither of the above forms of the Lord, as just described unto you, from the material angle of vision, so neither of them is accepted by the pure devotees of the Lord who know him well. 36. He, the personality of Godhead, manifests himself in a transcendental form, being the subject of his transcendental name, quality, pastimes, entourage, and transcendental variegatedness. Although he is unaffected by all such activities, he appears to be so engaged. So now verses 37 to 40, they are all together. O King, know from me that all living entities are created by the Supreme Lord according to their past deeds. This includes Brahma and his sons, like Daksha, the periodical heads like Vaivasvata Manu, the demigods like Indra, Chandra, and Varuna, the great sages like Bhrigu, Vyas, and Vasishta, the inhabitants of Pitriloka and Siddhaloka, the Charanas, Gandharvas, Vidyadharas, Asuras, Yakshas, Kinnaras, and angels, the serpentines, the monkey-shaped Kimpurushas, the human beings, the inhabitants of Matriloka, the demons, Pishachas, ghosts, spirits, lunatics, and evil spirits, the good and evil stars, the goblins, the animals in the forest, the birds, the household animals, the reptiles, the mountains, the moving and standing living entities, the living entities born from embryos, from eggs, from perspiration, and from seeds, and all others, whether they be in the water, land, or sky, in happiness, in distress, or in mixed happiness and distress. All of them, according to their past deeds, are created by the Supreme Lord. 41. According to the different modes of material nature, the mode of goodness, the mode of passion, and the mode of darkness, there are different living creatures who are known as demigods, human beings, and hellish living entities. O King, even a particular mode of nature being mixed with the other two is divided into three, and thus each kind of living creature is influenced by the other modes and acquires its habits also. 42. He, the personality of Godhead, as the maintainer of all in the universe, appears in different incarnations after establishing the creation, and thus he reclaims all kinds of conditioned souls amongst the humans, the non-humans, and the demigods. 43. Therefore, at the end of the millennium, the Lord himself, in the form of Rudra, the destroyer, will annihilate the complete creation as the wind displaces the clouds. 44. The great transcendentalists thus describe the activities of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but the pure devotees deserve to see more glorious things in transcendence beyond these features. 45. There is no direct engineering by the Lord for the creation and destruction of the material world. What is described in the Vedas about his direct interference is simply to counteract the idea that material nature is the creator. 46. This process of creation and annihilation, described in summary herein, is the regulative principle during the duration of Brahma's one day. It is also the regulative principle in the creation of Mahat, in which the material nature is dispersed. And finally, 47, we're almost at the end of the chapter and almost at the end of the second canto. 47, O King, I shall in due course explain the measurement of time in its gross and subtle features with the specific symptoms of each. But for the present, let me explain to you the Padma Kalpa. So devotees, that's quite a section, isn't it? Anyway, no problem. Let's just get into it. So it's the third section. It's titled The Creation by Garbhodakshai Vishnu. And it's from verse 10 to verse 47. So verse 10, after separating the different universes, the gigantic universal form of the Lord, Mahavishnu, which came out of the causal ocean, the place of appearance for the first Purusha avatar, entered into each of the separate universes, desiring to lie on the created transcendental water, Garbhodak. So, here we go, devotees. Let's get into it. So Shukadeva Goswami is now presenting the prime necessity of devotional service. This is how Prabhupada begins the purport. So, Prabhupada explains that Lord Krishna and his plenary portions, etc., are non-different. So there is supreme independence in each and every one of them. And therefore there's supreme independence in all of them. So Shukadeva Goswami, in order to prove this, as he's promised Maharaj Parikshit, describes the independence of the Purusha avatars. Their activities are also called Leela. Yeah, manifesting the material world, managing it and maintaining it. So hearing about them is very good for us. Not just the 10th canto, but to hear about the Purusha avatars and how they develop the world that we're living in. That's very good for us. Yes. So, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, those pastimes in Vrindavan, etc., they're for advanced devotees, and neophytes will be prone to misunderstand them. So for them, the pastimes related to the creation, etc., are more relishable in a very, very transcendental way. They are more relishable if one really appreciates the value of them. And Srila Prabhupada, let's see. Prabhupada makes the point, as the yoga system, mainly based on bodily exercises, is meant for the person who's too much attached to the bodily conception of existence. Similarly, the Lord's pastimes related to the creation and destruction of the material world are for those who are too materially attached. So, and Prabhupada makes the important point, something which he really emphasized, that the scientists, they focus on the physical laws, but they overlook the lawmaker, Krishna. So we shouldn't just appreciate some complex machine, but we should appreciate the engineer also. And in one sense, that's the difference between the devotees and the non-devotees. That the devotees always praise the Lord who directs physical laws. And in this regard, Prabhupada quotes Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, verse 10, that the material nature is working under my direction. Yeah, Prabhupada paraphrases at the end of that paragraph. So we go on to the second paragraph. Fools are astonished by the laws involved in making our bodies and the cosmos, but still they decry the existence of God, thinking the physical laws are independent. So Prabhupada then quotes Bhagavad, it's the next verse, chapter 9, verse 11 of Bhagavad Gita, that fools, mudha, fools think that the body of the Lord is like their body. Yeah. And therefore he cannot comprehend the unlimited power of the Lord. But still the Lord comes, and when he comes, he is visible. So the foolish people, the scientists and other fools, think that they consider the infinite and infinitesimal features of the Lord because they can't become infinite or infinitesimal. Yes. And Prabhupada says, the most wonderful manifestation of the Lord's power is exhibited when the infinite Lord becomes visible to our eyes as one of us. So then doing things like lifting Govardhan Hill, marrying 16,000 wives, 16,108. These are some examples of infinite energy. But of course the mudhas, the fools, they think they're legends, mythology. And Prabhupada concludes the paragraph by saying, they cannot understand that the Lord Sri Krishna, although in the form of a human being by his own potency, is still the Supreme Lord with full potency as the Supreme Controller. And then there's a very short third paragraph that even if these mudhas, these material scientists, and there are other fools too. There's no shortage of fools in the material world. So Prabhupada makes the point that even if those people, if at least they listen submissively to the messages of the Lord in Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam through disciplic succession, they become devotees. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, and for this reason only, either in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the pastimes of the Lord in the material world are delineated for the benefit of those men with a poor fund of knowledge. Yes. So even the mudhas can become devotees if they hear submissively from the right sources about the science of Krishna consciousness. It's the descending process. So now, verse 11, that supreme person is not impersonal and therefore is distinctively a nara or person. Therefore the transcendental water created from the supreme nara is known as Nara. And because he lies down on that water, he is known as Narayana. Yes, it's a practice in Vedic culture. When something or someone is the source of something or someone else, the names may be the same, except in the one that is produced, the first syllable may be lengthened. So the supreme Nara, the transcendental water created from the supreme Nara, is known as Nara. Yeah. So there's no purport there to verse 11. Let's go on to verse 12. One should definitely know that all material ingredients, activities, time and modes, and the living entities who are meant to enjoy them all, that they all exist by his mercy alone. And as soon as he does not care for them, everything becomes non-existent. So Srila Prabhupada gives nice purport, stressing a number of points which have already been mentioned. So first thing, we're enjoyers of the material world, of time, of the modes, etc. Why? Because we want to lord it over them, over the material nature. But the Lord is the supreme enjoyer, and we're meant to assist his enjoyment, and in that way get our enjoyment. It's an interesting point. If we give the Lord enjoyment, then we get enjoyment. We share in his enjoyment. But unfortunately, in illusion, we want to become the enjoyers like the Lord, although we're not meant for that type of enjoyment. So Prabhupada gives some explanations now about us and our position, which is, as I said, he's done before. It's not the first time, but the emphasis is very important. So we're paraprakriti. We're not paruchas. Our spirit of enjoyment here is false. But when our spirit of enjoyment here reduces, then Maya, the material energy, dictates that we should think of becoming one with the Lord. And that's the last snare of Maya. So, but when we get over that by the mercy of the Lord, we become reinstated in our original position. And that's the purpose of this material world. Ultimately, that's the purpose, not just as a field for enjoyment or of a place of suffering. It's for us to go back to Godhead. Prabhupada therefore concludes the purport by saying, the living entities are therefore completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord, and all their so-called enjoyments by scientific improvement are crushed into dust when the Lord desires. Maybe you've experienced some crushing. Verse 13, the Lord, while lying on his bed of mystic slumber, generated the seminal symbol, golden in hue, through external energy out of his desire to manifest varieties of living entities from himself alone. Okay, so let's have a look at the purport. Prabhupada quotes Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, verses 7 and 8, that before the creation of the material world, that, well, first of all, that the creation and annihilation of this world is described in those two verses of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9, verses 7 and 8. Then in the second paragraph, before the creation, the Lord exists as total energy, Mahasamasti. Then wanting to expand as many, he expands as what Prabhupada calls the multi-total energy. Also known, well, the total energy was Mahasamasti. The multi-total energy is just Samashti. So from the multi-total energy, he expands us into individuals, Prabhupada says, in 3 dimensions, namely Adhyatmic, Adhidaivic, and Adhibautic. And of course, because everything is expanded from Mahavishnu or Mahasamasti, nothing is different from him. Everything has specific functions as designed by him. So Prabhupada quotes the last sentence of the paragraph. The living entities are also similar energy, marginal potency of the Lord, and thus they are simultaneously one with and different from him. And third paragraph, when things are not manifested, the living energies remain potent within him, but when they come out, they're exhibited differently in terms of their different desires. So the living entities in the spiritual world are unconditionally surrendered, and so they're not subject to the conditions of creation and annihilation. So, 14, just hear from me how the potency of his lordship divides one into three, called the controlling entities, the controlled entities, and the material bodies. So just hear about these things in the manner mentioned above. 15. From the sky, situated within the transcendental body of the manifesting Mahavishnu, sense energy, mental force, and bodily strength are all generated, as well as the sum total of the fountainhead of the total living force. 16. As the followers of a king follow their lord, similarly when the total energy is in motion, all other living entities move, and when the total energy stops endeavoring, all other living entities stop sensual activities. So, when it comes to the individual living entities, anyway, we're completely dependent on the total energy of the Supreme Purusha. That's the point, really. It's like the dependency of electrical items on the powerhouse, but the powerhouse depends on water for generating electricity, and water depends on the clouds depend on the sun depends on the creation, and the creation depends on movement of the Lord. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, thus the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the cause of all causes. Verse 70. The living force being agitated by the Virat Purusha generated hunger and thirst, and when he desired to drink and eat, the mouth opened. Gosh. So Prabhupada says the process of the living entities within the womb of the mother, developing sense organs and sense perceptions, seems to follow the same principles as the Virat Purusha, the sum total of all living entities. So therefore the supreme cause of all generation is not impersonal. Prabhupada says the desires for all kinds of sense perception and sense organs exist in the Supreme, and thus they take place in the individual persons. So this nature, this desire is the nature of the Lord, the absolute truth. Because he has the sum total of all mouths, we have mouths. And the same with all the senses and sense organs. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, here the mouth is a symbolic representation of all sense organs for the same principles apply to the others also. Verse 18. From the mouth the palate became manifested, and thereupon the tongue was also generated. After this, all the different tastes came into existence, so that the tongue can relish them. Okay, so let's have a look at the purport. Prabhupada begins by saying, this gradual process of evolution suggests the explanation of the controlling deities Adidaiva, because Varuna is the controlling deity for all relishable juices. And this, therefore, he suggests that therefore the mouth becomes the resting place for the tongue, which tastes, of which the presiding deity is Varuna, the tongue which tastes. So it suggests that Varuna was also generated with the tongue. So the tongue and the palate, being instrumental, are adibhutam, or forms of matter. But the deity is Adidaiva. The person undergoing the function is Adhyatma. Thus the birth of the three categories after opening of the mouth of the Virat Rusha is explained. Prabhupada explains. Let's just go over it again. The tongue and the palate, being instrumental, are adibhutam, the physical body, or forms of matter. But the deity controlling it all is Adidaiva, of course. That's Varuna. And the person, the living entity, the jiva, undergoing the function within the body, but being separate from the actual function itself, is Adhyatma. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the four principles mentioned in this verse serve to explain the three main principles, namely the Adhyatma, Adidaiva, and Adibhutam, as explained before. So we go on to verse 19. When the Supreme desired to speak, speeches were vibrated from the mouth. Then the controlling deity fire was generated from the mouth. But when he was lying in the water, all these functions remained suspended. Okay, into the purport. Prabhupada begins by making the point that the activities of the sense organs are controlled by the Supreme. The senses they give a license to us so we can use them properly under the control of the presiding deity deputed by the Lord. But if the regulations for their use is violated, one is punished by degradation to lower status of life. And the example which was just given is the tongue and the controlling deity Varuna. Yes, so Prabhupada explains the tongue is for eating, and men, animals, and birds have different tastes because of different licenses. That's a good way to put it, isn't it? We have the license to enjoy nice prasadam, but the hogs have the license to enjoy stool and not for enjoying nice prasadam. And then the dog or the tiger or lion has a license for eating meat and tasting blood. So they're really in a different category. So the controlling deity awards the particular type of body when the living entity develops a taste in terms of certain modes of nature. So if we develop taste without discrimination like the pig, then the controlling deity will give the person a pig's body. But it's God's grace, because the conditioned soul desired that body, or, that's one way of putting it. It's not, but it may not be that the conditioned soul was actually thinking, I want the body of a pig. But by his actions of eating without discrimination, then the conditioned soul shows that they need a body which is suited for that. Yeah. Which in this case would be a pig's body. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, a human being, therefore, must be on his guard as to what sort of body he's going to have in the next life. An irresponsible life of indiscrimination is risky, and that is the declaration of all scriptures. Therefore, when the Supreme Purusha desired to smell odors, the nostrils and respiration were generated, the nasal instrument and odors came into existence, and the controlling deity of air, carrying smell, also became manifested. This is all to do with smelling odors. Nostrils and respiration were there. The nasal instrument means the nose was there, and then odors came into existence, plus the controlling deity of all these things. Yes, so all simultaneously. Yeah, and Prabhupada refers to the Vedic mantras. They confirm that what we've just said, the nasal instrument, odor, and the controlling deity, air, smelling, etc., all became manifested simultaneously when the Lord desired to smell. So the Upanishads, yes, they say everything's desired by the Lord before the living entity can act on it. So the living entity can only see when the Lord sees. Living entity can only smell when the Lord smells, etc. The idea being we can't do anything independently. We can think of acting independently, but we cannot actually act independently. So independence in thinking is there by the grace of the Lord, but it can become manifest by His grace as fact. So therefore there's famous saying, which Prabhupada quoted on a number of occasions, man proposes, God disposes. So in other words, the whole explanation, Prabhupada says, is on the subject of the absolute dependence of the living entities and absolute independence of the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, less intelligent persons claiming to be on an equal level with God must first prove themselves to be absolute and independent, and then they must substantiate their claim to become one with God. So, verse 21. Thus, when everything existed in darkness, the Lord desired to see Himself and all that was created. Then the eyes, the illuminating God, Sun, the power of vision and the object of sight, all became manifested. So Prabhupada makes the point that by nature the universe is very dark, dense darkness. Therefore, generally the material creation is called tamas, or darkness. Night. Night is the real feature of the universe, because then you can't see anything, including yourself. But anyway, the Lord, out of his mercy only, causeless mercy, not because he really wanted to for himself, but just out of his mercy, desired to see himself in all creation, so the Son was manifested. Then the power of vision became possible, and objects of vision manifested. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, this means that the whole phenomenal world became visible after the creation of the sun. Because when the sun is there, we can see ourselves and the world. Okay, 22. By development of the desire of the great sages to know, the ears, the power of hearing, the controlling deity of hearing, and the objects of hearing became manifested. The great sages desired to hear about the self. Right, so Bhagavad Gita tells us that by advancement of knowledge, we should try to know the Lord. Knowledge doesn't just mean about the physical laws that work in this material nature. And we see that people want to hear through watching television. They want to hear about things happening far away. But people should know that the power of hearing and its instruments are given by the Lord to hear about the self or about the Lord himself. But unfortunately nowadays the power of hearing is misused by hearing about mundane affairs. So Prabhupada says the great sages were interested in hearing about the Lord through Vedic knowledge and nothing more. That is the beginning of oral reception of knowledge. Okay, Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.